take a train, it is still fashionable. Not only is it fashionable, it is in many instances still the safest and least fatiguing way of getting there, and likely to remain so. This train is the northbound diesel-hauled Thames Clyde Express on its daily 426-mile London, Leeds and Glasgow service, a strenuous journey made comfortably and punctually in a little over 8 hours. The passengers now on this train, and indeed every one of the thousands of people who use the service, do so because express rail travel is incomparably safe, fast and relaxing, brought to a pitch of perfection through the experience of more years than any of us cares to remember. Passengers no longer marvel at the speeds and the timings of these long-distance trains, or at the statistics of the great locomotives which haul them, as is the familiar security represented by the modern railway carriage. Nevertheless, transport is a highly competitive business, and notwithstanding their long and fine tradition of public service, the railways are fighting bitter battles with competitors of much more recent origin. Yet an express train was an accepted, everyday thing a century ago. And if competition with other carriers is fierce today, competition between the scores of independent railway companies which existed prior to 1923 was even hotter, and only the shrewder and the more efficient survived. One such was the Midland Railway Company, which served the citizens and the commerce of this nation from 1844 until 1923. Its red engine and rolling stock were familiar sights. In London, and in Leicester, on Nottingham, in Liverpool, in Leeds, in Bradford, in Derby, Birmingham, Gloucester, Bristol, and a score of lesser places. Among the great corporations which constitute railway companies of the centres, the Midland occupied a lofty position. It was, indeed, a great railway, and its greatness, both in conception and execution, is not better illustrated than by its solution of a serious problem which had confronted it for some years, and the crux of which was reached in the year 1866. This problem was to secure a fair share of the valuable Scottish traffic. Whereas the London and North Western and Caledonian railways control the west coast route over Shap Fell, and the Great Northern and the North Eastern railways the east coast route through Doncaster and York, the Midland terminated at the Little Dales village of Ingleton, and dependent upon good relations with the London North Western Railway thereafter. But instead of good relations, there was much ill will, much delay, and many recriminations. So the Midland determined to build an independent way, and that way eventually led from the little market town of Settle to the great Citadel station in Carlisle, embracing en route over 70 miles of the finest railway engineering accomplishments known in this land. Many writers and photographers have already chronicled the historical and geographical details of the Settle and Carlisle line. Yet our interest in it and our desire to visit the scenes of past endeavour and achievement led us to these wild and remote parts of western Yorkshire. What follows is a record of our travels, which virtually began at Hellifield on the 11:58 a.m. A stopping train taking milk to everywhere, and metaphorically taking tea everywhere, emphasizing thereby the intimate atmosphere in certain districts of a line which, above all, caters for fast-through traffic. We have attempted also an appreciation of the Midland Railway pioneers, whose foresight, skill and determination almost 100 years ago made it possible today for express trains to thunder over the roof of England. The long drag from Settle Junction to Blea Moor called forth all their persistence and ingenuity. A mile and a half south of Settle is Settle Junction. Here diverges the original main line to Ingleton, and here in November 1869 the first sod of the new Scottish route was cut. This is the very beginning of the long drag, or the first 20 miles of the Settle and Carlisle line, so called because of the gruelling climb of over 700 feet with a ruling gradient of 1 in 100 to Blea Moor Tunnel, an endurance test for engines and enginemen alike. There is a small disused station here, declared redundant soon after the line was opened, and today it has the air of a forlorn sentinel standing guard at the entrance to the Great Fell line. Opposite, Mr. Evans, the signalman, pulls over his levers, the modern diesel-hauled express thunders over the junction and begins the long climb. Arrive at Settle, a lovely little market town in the Yorkshire Dales. And here we meet the station master, Mr. Taylor, who has made an attractive station even more so by cultivating 1,000 varieties of rock plants in his flower beds and greenhouse. Standing on the platform, discussing with Mr. Taylor his particular interest in collecting alpine plants, we are facing north towards Bennett and the mountains. miles from Settle, the line passes the former Craven limestone quarries, and a cutting bypasses Stainforth village. Here we should not miss looking at Stainforth Force and Bridge, a delightful spot less than 400 yards from the railway. And from here the line is carried at considerable elevation over the Ribble by a beautifully engineered skew bridge at Sheriff Brow. Thence crossing and recrossing the swift-flowing river at Ribblehead Viaduct number 28 and Helwith Bridge. All these are lesser examples of the great structures which lie ahead. In this area, the engineers had great difficulty in selecting the best route, due largely to the winding nature of the river, which subsequently had a new course blasted out for it, while the railway was laid along its former bed. Limestone is part of the natural wealth of Ribblesdale, and thousands of tons are moved by rail every year. 4.5 miles of sidings laid down at Horton testify to its importance. The great limestone mass of Pennygent broods over this village and the railway. It was once inquired of E.O. Ferguson, site engineer to the Midland Railway, "Where is Pennygent near?" And he replied, "Near nowhere. Everywhere is near Pennygent." Henceforward the difficulties increased. The cutting which follows, insignificant enough now in appearance, was found to be composed of a hated and unique boulder clay, causing conditions of which John S. Crossley, chief civil engineer to the Midland Railway, said, "I have known the men blast the boulder clay like rock, and within a few hours, if it had rained, to ladle out the same stuff from the same spot like soup in buckets, and even at this early stage men were downing tools and asking for their money." But one of the most important requirements was a colossal quantity of readily accessible stone, required to feed the vast engineering works simultaneously proceeding ahead. And quite near to the line, on the left, almost 2 miles of quarry face were worked by gangs of masons, quarrymen and labourers. Large surplus stones of huge proportions are still to be seen projecting through the vegetation that now covers this scene of one-time industry. while across the line the typical railwaymen's cottages are still known as Salt Lake. And the occupant of number 1 Salt Lake, a Mr. Alfred Fleck, is a descendant of one of the original workmen, and was shows this apparently quite ordinary item of whitewood furniture. It is, in fact, the actual desk used in paying the wages of the quarry workmen during the days of construction. Mention has already been made of great engineering works already proceeding ahead. These were above all the construction of the great viaduct at Ribblehead and the boring of Blea Moor Tunnel. Immediately preceding these works, and in splendid isolation under the great shadow of Whernside, with the flat top of Ingleborough on the left and Blea Moor on the right, is the small station of Ribblehead, at one and the same time the District Railway Administrative Centre and Air Ministry Weather Station. Here on the platform we made the acquaintance of congenial Bill Sharp, the station master, who has been specially trained in weather reporting, and he described to us one evening how rainfall, wind velocity and wind direction are recorded in his comfortable station office, illuminated by the traditional oil lamp. Mr. Sharp was assisted here by his son Geoffrey, who is also his entire staff. To the northeast of this station was situated the great hutted camp known variously as Ribblehead, Batty Moss or Batty Green, which for 5 years accommodated the labour force engaged upon both viaduct and tunnel in one of the wildest and the windiest places in the world. On this site, during the years 1869 to 1875, lived over 2,000 people. The navvies, the labourers, their wives and their families. They had their own school, their own mission, their own post office, even their own library. For this was indeed a town, and you might call this track one of its streets. Stories about this camp are legion, and in many respects rival those of the Wild West. Remaining traces of it are few, but time and the elements have not obliterated everything. Here, for instance, stones were dressed. Here was a lime kiln in which mortar was fired. And here bricks were fired on site. Here lie large dressed stones laid by the side of the tramway. The marks of the drills are still outstanding. Here was a workman's shelter, probably also used for the dressing of stones. During that first bleak winter of 1869, a 2-mile-long, 2-foot gauge tramway, sweeping round through the campsite and over to Blea Moor, was constructed in an amazingly short space of time, and within 1 month a small steam locomotive was hauling its train of wagons along this track. Here lived and worked a rough and noble people. They ate hugely, they drank largely, they fought, quarrelled, worshipped and feared God, and by the year 1875 had erected their most colossal monument, Ribblehead Viaduct. a quarter of a mile long and 165 feet high to the spring of the arch, all piers of its 24 spans are sunk 25 feet below ground into the solid rock. The arches swallowed 1.5 million bricks, and many individual stones weighed between 7 and 8 tons. This vast structure, raised course upon course by an army of masons clinging to wooden scaffolding, and aided only by the simplest of mechanical devices, curves majestically across the valley. And yet, set against the background of mountains and moors, it seems a mere thread, struggling to withstand the onslaught of North Ribblesdale weather. The next 2 miles of trek, in their profusion of wild flowers, seen by us in their sheltered cuttings in summertime, seemed to belie completely the grim nature of the greatest task of all which lay ahead, the boring of the 1.5 mile long tunnel through the gritstone and limestone mass which is Blea Moor. James Allport, General Manager of the Midland Railway from 1860 to 1880, said,
"I shall not forget, as long as I live, the difficulties that surrounded us in that undertaking.
And for 4.5 years, from Sunday night at 10 until the following Saturday night at 10, gangs of men working 12-hour shifts toiled beneath this mountain at the 2 ends and at the faces of 7 shafts sunk down through the moor. Not willingly did Blea Moor surrender itself to men and machines, and when their Herculean labours were concluded, continual vigilance was and is still required, because the conditions in this dark cavern play havoc with tunnel lining and permanent way. It was, whilst a tunnel inspection was taking place, that, armed with pressure lanterns, we eagerly joined the gang of oilskinned railwaymen in their journey into the depths of the tunnel. We are 500 feet below the surface of the moor. Once beyond the penetration of brilliant light from the north portal, we had no difficulty whatever in imagining the scenes in the tunnel 90 years ago. Gangs of stalwart men, clad in vests and knee breeches, worked on their hands and knees, hand-drilling the holes in the rock, which they then filled with dynamite, at that time a new plaything costing £200 per ton. Their sole means of illumination was a legion of wax candles, whose dim light flickered down from rocky ledges through the dripping, murky vapour. Inch by inch and yard by yard, they drilled and they blasted their way in temperatures now as high as 80 degrees and now as low as winter's ice. Men were driven mad by foul air, darkness, damp and explosive stone, and they earned every penny of the then considerable rate of 10 shillings per day. Dense smoke, which in spite of the ventilation shafts refused to clear, used to be one of the more objectionable features of this tunnel, but the advent of diesel traction has done much to alleviate this. As we walked back from the inspection, our eyes fixed upon that pinpoint of light far ahead, we had to stand aside and well clear as the Up Thames Slide Express entered the tunnel. passed, we hastened forward again, and soon, and not unwillingly, we were once more out in the clear mountain air and sunshine, ready for a brew of tea. After tea and a clean-up, we walked back to examine the North Portal and to see the Down Thames slide emerge from it, a sight and a sound which provided ample evidence of the modern diesel-electric locomotive's capacity to cope with the long drag. Climbing the South Portal again, we were just in time to see another Scottish express enter the tunnel. We followed then the old tramway up over Blea Moor, amazed at the mountainous spoil heaps of rock dragged from the bowels of the earth. And at last, at the summit, more than 500 feet above the line, we caught this breathtaking view of Dentdale beyond. Less than a mile from Blea Moor North Portal is Ribblehead Viaduct, another remarkable structure, similar in many respects to Ribblehead, although only 1/3 its length. Some of its great columns rest in a quarry of local stone, which, when polished, is known as dent, or black marble. Great engineering like this, carried on sometimes in appalling conditions, was necessarily accompanied by considerable danger, which, coupled with illness, carelessness and personal violence, contributed to a total of over 100 deaths in the areas of Ribblehead and Dentdale alone. But they are buried here, and they do not lack commemoration. 2 miles below Ribblehead is the tiny chapel of St. Leonard and All Angels, Chapel the Dale. And within the church is a white marble tablet dedicated to those who died. They now lie in the quiet graveyard outside. It has been mentioned that essentially this is a through line designed primarily for the swift passage of both passenger and goods expresses and with little local traffic of its own. This means that maintenance has to be continuous and thorough and conducted largely upon the day of least traffic, which of course is Sunday. We were fortunate one Sunday afternoon in coming upon some very interesting permanent way work involving prefabricated lengths of track in the vicinity of Dent Viaduct. Watching these railwaymen relaying the trek with speed and coordination, we were forcibly reminded of those who had gone before and who had thrust forward, changing the face of this remote landscape and setting lines and levels destined to become one of the great rail highways of the world. Other men were also hard at work in contemporary engineering spheres, and so it was that the original permanent way laid down between Settle and Carlisle was of a new high-grade steel derived from Henry Basima's converter process. Beyond, through shale cutting, the line curves to Artengill. This 120 feet high viaduct, built over the stream from which it takes its name, is constructed of the same locally quarried stone known as Dent marble. Foundation difficulties led to some of these great piers being sunk 55 feet down through peat washing and clay to rest upon solid rock. In looking at this structure, you are looking at upwards of 50,000 tons of stone, which, when viewed from the old tramway track down to the valley, appears a splendid piece of Victorian tracery. At this point, there is a beautiful bird's eye view of the Vale of Dent. No busy smoky town is to be seen close by or in the distance. Nothing but the greenest of green fields, speckled over with lazy herds of cattle, while here and there lie the homesteads whose inhabitants have that simplicity of life which rural solitudes alone can give. And in these solitudes lies Dent village, of narrow cobbled streets and old-world whitewashed cottages. It can clearly be seen here how in Dentdale the line is borne literally upon a shelf cut high up the slopes of Widdale Fell and curves majestically around to Dent Station. Another small Gothic-style building perched uniquely 500 feet above the mountain slope and more than 4 miles distant from Dent village itself. Here the station master, David Graham, lives in the highest station master's house in England, specially constructed to withstand the howling gales and violent storms. 90 inches of rain per year are not unknown at Dent, and 3 lines of railway sleepers, 1,150 feet above sea level, have been erected as snow barriers. And on that same Sunday in October, we left David Graham at Dent, where his chief duty that day was to act as pilotman for the trains which had to pass the permanent way repairs, and walked to another of the largest works on the line, Rise Hill Tunnel. This 1,213-yard-long tunnel through blue limestone had most of the attendant difficulties experienced in boring Blea Moor, and here again a temporary village was built on the hilltop, accommodating some 350 persons 1,300 feet above sea level. The material removed in boring was lifted by steam engines through 2 permanent shafts to the top of the hill, but ironically enough, the scarcity of ballast at the time meant that much of it had to be brought down again to become the bed of the permanent way. Beyond this tunnel, the line enters Garsdale and meets the highest water troughs in Britain. A quarter of a mile long, laid down in the year 1907, and invaluable for the speedy replenishment of boiler water after the long drag. At Garsdale, there branched eastwards at one time a 6-mile line to Hawes. This route is now closed. Intermingled weeds and once cultivated flowers run riot over the forlorn and the derelict buildings, and the greater part of the track has been lifted. At Garsdale Station, the library and the social centre were in the tank house, and an old carriage served as a supper annex. Here, too, divine service was held in the waiting room, for Garsdale exists solely as a railway community. The famous stockaded turntable has always aroused curiosity. The stockade is in fact a windbreak, built as the result of an incident some time prior to 1905, when engine on the table was taken charge of by the wind and whirled round so rapidly that the crew were unable even to approach it, until its merry progress was arrested in the end by throwing ashes into the turntable pit. Just past the station and turntable is Halifax Viaduct. Here an embankment was originally planned, but the sticky peat refused to hold, and the idea was abandoned after 2 years of abortive tipping. Sinkings of 15 feet had to be made before a firm foundation was discovered. Situated in an almost inaccessible area, this structure is also known as Moor Viaduct and takes the line round to the west and to the highest point on the line. Gill summit, 1,167 feet above sea level. In wild and rugged country, Yorkshire here gives way to Westmoreland. The lonely signal box, manned weekdays only, is actually on the county border, and a large sign informs travellers that the summit of the route has been attained, and virtually this is the end of the long drag. At this period of the 19th century, though, North Ribblesdale was virtually devoid of human habitation, and only one rutted turnpike road ran between Lancaster and Richmond. In the year 1868, the Hill Inn was one of only 2 inns on this road. And in 1962, we were, on many occasions during our wanderings, more than grateful for the warm welcome extended by Mr. and Mrs. Tom Kilburn, who, with their forebears, have kept the old inn since soon after the completion of the railway. Tom's grandfather used to recall the days when, as a boy, he took round a basketful of kippers and sold them to the navvies. This wintry scene reminded us forcibly of that which must in December 1868 have confronted the first survey party. Ice covered the backs of the fell sheep, and there was not a trace of shelter for man or beast. The other inn, now no longer a hotel, still stands and has its own story. This is Gearstones, and to this place in 1868 came John Charland, a Tasmanian engineer and surveyor, commissioned by the Midland Railway to get up there and find a way. Encompassed for mile upon mile by the bleak and rugged hills, these were the desolate surroundings in which these pioneers laid the foundations of a great railway. And equally grim and forbidding appeared these surroundings during the winter of 1962 and 3. Great and ghostly icicles depended in Moor tunnel. Ribblehead station was almost completely snowbound. And unremitting frost and solid ice were the worst enemies. But when road conditions were absolutely impossible, for as long as they were able, the great expresses struggled on. And they struggled on until even they became absolutely bedevilled by speed restrictions over track which the bitter and intense cold had literally distorted out of gauge. Every Sunday, permanent way gangs toiled to clear pack ice from the cuttings. Snowplows worked all night long to struggle through to Gill, and it cannot be too strongly emphasized to what extent, in these conditions, the rural communities concerned are absolutely dependent upon the railway for life's bare necessities. But leaving winter scenes behind, proceeding once again towards Carlisle, Wild Moor Fell is seen to the west, embellished against still snow-capped to the east. Here we enter the quarter-mile-long Burkitt Tunnel through the Great Pennine Fault, consisting of shale, limestone, grit, slate, iron, coal and lead ore, a truly remarkable geological combination. 50 miles remain, but they are miles of scenery much more beguiling and of engineering works incomparably lighter. The line rolls on to Kirkby Stephen, a small market town of 2,000 inhabitants. And after this, Artengill Viaduct. 130 feet high, this is a noble work of grey limestone, unique in that it rests not upon solid rock, for none was to be found, but upon a bed of red shale, to find which the foundations had to be sunk 45 feet. And fittingly, the last stone was laid by the wife of the chief civil engineer on the 8th of June, 1875. The smaller tunnels, the bridges and the smaller viaducts continue. Grosby Garrett, Griseburn and Helm. In the area of this contract alone, the turnover of labour amounted to 30,000 men in the 5 years of construction. And this is by far the easier part of the line from a constructional point of view. Now, by means of Ormside Viaduct, we make the first crossing of the beautiful River Eden to enter Appleby, the largest intermediate town on the line, 42.5 miles from Settle Junction, and an agricultural centre where great cattle and horse fairs have been held through the centuries, and from where considerable quantities of local dairy farm produce and vegetables are dispatched. Thousands of gallons of milk in glass-lined tank wagons are marshalled here for forward transit. And here 6 are being attached to our stopping passenger train, which will take them to Carlisle and thence in a special milk train to London. Leaving Appleby via Battlebarrow Bank, the line continues through Westmoreland, threading the lovely Eden Gorge, in its kindly serenity of scenery, a complete contrast to much of what we have seen before. Several small tunnels and 8 pretty little stations succeed each other in the space of 30 miles, each station serving its own rural community. Again, it cannot be overstressed how vitally important, in both fair weather and foul, the railway is to these isolated places and people. For the remaining 15 miles, the railway and the graceful river keep company until the approaches to the great citadel station in Carlisle. And here, on the 2nd of May 1876, the first Midland passenger train came to rest, and Midland Red at last joined the liveries of the other railway companies which so numerously congregated at this great railway to Scotland. And so also in this magnificent station serving the great city did our personal adventures and our travels come to an end, and we were moved to reflect how, at the time, Midland shareholders must have been justly satisfied and justly proud of their new steel link over the roof of England. For it was above all their cardinal stake in the Scottish traffic, and it had cost them nearly £4 million, or no less than £47,500 per mile. To remote and rural solitudes, to wild and forbidding fells, the Midland Railway brought the great steam locomotives that thundered across the land in the golden railway age of the 19th and 20th centuries. Across the span of almost 90 years, by day and by night, an average of 80 trains in every 24 hours have used this line. The romantic aura surrounding all railways, their steam locomotives and their famous trains, has engendered a fascination which few boys, and for that matter few boys grown to men, have found it in them to resist. And although today the steam locomotives and even the railway links themselves are fewer, the fascination remains. And it still remains in the purposeful hum of the huge diesel electrics thrusting over the wild moors to Gill and beyond. In these solitudes, where only the conies play and the curlews scream, few other than railwaymen and privileged observers have seen and examined in detail the colossal technical achievements and the impressive scenic panorama which are such remarkable features, not only of the long drag in particular, but of the Settle and Carlisle line as a whole.